Hey guys, welcome to a process video of a recent piece that I had just finished. I thought it'd be interesting to take you guys from point A to point B, and so let's just dive straight into it. Where did I get the idea from? How did I, before even getting into the sketch and the drawing, um, I was designing a character not too long ago, and it was this kind of character that their species had just developed the ability to emerge from the water onto land. And so they're kind of this culture that appreciates underwater living, if that makes sense, but they're also capable of walking around and they're bipedal. But they're small. That was one of the things. And so I was thinking, they could use armor or the clothing based on shells that they would find, or weapons would be based on the monsters. Well, monsters to them, but normal creatures to us, like crabs or shrimp or things like that. And so they would take those and use those as weapons, like shark's teeth, of you know monsters that they've overcome in the past or whatever. And I thought one of their design aspects could be based off of brain coral. I was thinking, well, they come from the land, and they come from the ocean. Why don't they have designs based off of, their environment from their past? One of their past is, they probably were around a lot of coral, and so they probably found a lot of inspiration from coral designs. And an interesting coral design was brain coral, and if you look it up, it's got this very interesting squiggly pattern that's very efficient in its space, in like the amount of space it covers. It's very efficient. So I tried applying this to that specific character, and it didn't really work out. I couldn't really. It felt too intelligent for the type of species that I was aiming for. So I kind of put it on the back burner, and I, continued designing that guy. But it kind of tossed that idea kind of sat in the back of my mind, and I wanted to do a piece about it because I thought that pattern was really cool and it kind of deserved its own exploration. And so I started a new canvas, on a cinematic composition, and I started sketching, and now I sketch with a very basic circle brush, very hard. You know, that's it. That's all it is. Flow at 57, just to make the taper feel a little more natural. But apart from that, it feels like a technical pen. It feels, very responsive, and you can do a lot of it. You can do a lot with it, and it's very versatile. Now, I only really use two brushes. So I use this circle brush, and what's nice about it is that you can bring it up in size, and you can do really large changes, or you can soften it and you can get really nice gradients with it. But not only that, I used the circle brush, but then I also used a brush that I found from a brush pack. And this is a very popular brush pack. It's Jamie Jones, essentially, and one of the top inspirations of mine ever since the beginning, ever since learning about him. And this is one of his brushes. Here's what it looks like. Here's the silhouette of it. It's just, what's special about it is that it's flat on the top and it's flat on the bottom, and it goes in the direction of your stroke. But essentially, it's flat on the top and it's flat on the bottom. It's a hard edge, and then it's soft on either side. And what that gives you is the ability to define hard edges and soft edges at the same time. And that's surprisingly really powerful, that I've found, at least. And it allows you to create a lot of very subtle value changes while keeping things textured, but keeping things defined, right? It's a subtle gradation, but you get the edges, which helps define the shape that you want to make, or the form that you're trying to develop, I guess. And so I basically use those two brushes for the majority. If you find like another, like this is another brush that has the same sort of thing. It's textured, it's hard on top, hard on bottom, soft on the sides. That's essentially what you want, and it goes in the direction of your brush stroke, of your pen, Wacom pen stroke, or whatever. It's the same sort of thing. You know, those aren't. I won't say that they're the end all be all of brushes. You know, they certainly fit me for the look that I want. But if that doesn't suit you, you know, keep looking for the brushes that you want. I mean, there's loads of them out there. I don't remember where I got this one specifically, but I know that the one that I found in Jamie Jones, like that's Jamie Jones. You know, that's his brush pack, and I'll put a link in the description of where you can find that. And this is what it looks like in the pack. But anyway, so I basically use those two brushes. So I'm starting out very simple, just kind of laying out a composition of, you know, where do I want these elements to sit? You know, where, in a general sense, without thinking too much, where do I want to start? You know, I want something here, I want something here, and I want something here, and I want something here, right? Just a general idea. And just to get started with it, I'm not really thinking too much other than I want these spires emerging out of the ground, essentially. And they're going to be, in my mind, they're going to be this brain corally design. That's all I have. And so, but right now I'm more worried about developing a good composition and developing something that feels the way I want it to feel. So I'm just using that textured brush, and I'm basically just laying in value shapes, essentially. I'm only using 3 values mainly. I'm using this dark foreground, kind of this middle ground gray, and then this almost white background. And that's a pretty good way to achieve depth, is to have a dark foreground and a light background. And as you keep adding elements and different values, you know, it feels like it's going back into space. And now this over here, this is just the navigator. It kind of gives me an overall sense. You know, you could be zoomed in super close, and you know, you can still appreciate the overall, and you can still keep an eye on what the overall image is looking like. It's always a good idea to zoom out as far as you can, to about a postage stamp size, and just continually check on the composition and the overall. Does the overall idea read at this size? If it does, great. Then, you know, things are working, your values are working. That's mainly what you want, is your values to be working at this size. If they aren't working, you have to reapproach the way you're designing your shapes, and reapproach the way you're constructing your value layout, I would say. You know, value structure, that's a better word for it. So essentially, you know, this is the foreground, this is the midground, and this is the background, and you get a good sense of depth, and you get a good sense of these are spires going into the background, right? And that reads from super tiny, and that's what you want, right? If it reads from here, it'll read from here. If it doesn't read from here, it won't read, or you'll have trouble reading it or trouble understanding it at this size. So, because basically this is basically what the first read is. When somebody glances at your image, this is what they see, and you want it to make sense, right? So make sure that this reads upon a quick glance at like such a tiny size. As long as that reads, that's super important. It's so important. Make sure what you're doing reads at such a small size, because that's the first impression, essentially. And you can always flip it at a small size and see if it works there. But yeah, enough talking about that. So just laying in value shapes of where I want these elements to be. I'm also I'm also deciding how far each element is in terms of value. So this is a certain value, this is a certain value. This spire, which is the main focus, ideally, is going to be this value. And the darkests are probably going to be around this value. I'm not going to go darker than this because then it's going to feel like it's more in the foreground, essentially. So you want to be limited to the value structure that you've set to yourself. Okay? So from here, so a quick technique. So I use a lot of layers and I try to organize it in groups. Some people are good at naming their layers. I'm horrible at it. So what I do essentially when I feel like I'm ready to go to the next step, I select all, I hit Control A or Command A. Control A to select all, and then Control Shift C to copy merged. And what copy merged does is it basically takes the flattened image and it copies it. Essentially what you're seeing on the screen, it copies it. If I just copy from a layer, it's only gonna, if I just press Control C on a specific layer, it's only gonna copy what's on that layer. However, Control Shift C basically flattens the image. So if I hit Control Shift C and I hit paste, you can see that this entire image has been pasted onto a single layer. And that's just a quick way to flatten your image and to just get on with it, essentially. So that's what I do. So for this next layer, and you can see that there are some differences that will occur, and that's okay, depending on, at this stage, it doesn't really matter to me. The amount of changes is really determined by just the way layers interact and the different layer blending modes that you have. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But, it's just a fast way of getting to a flattened image and not really worrying too much about layers. And so now, that's right, I'm laying in basically just line work of how I want things to look and what type of elements need to be where. So I'm determining, okay, this is going to be the width of this brain coral pattern compared to the values of the brain coral pattern in the background. And here's going to be some, maybe it's broken off in some pieces, so there's going to be some elements. But again, I'm still retaining to the local value structure of this particular, I guess, plane. This is closer to us than this, so this is just going to be darker inherently comparative to this. I'm just trying to maintain that just so I don't forget. Because it can sometimes be easy to forget. You get in here and you're like, oh, I need this to be darker, so I'm going to paint it darker. But then you go back and it's like, oh wait, that's way too dark. It needs to be this gray in order for it to feel right. So it's just a good way to keep yourself in check. But yeah, I had these pools that I wanted to. I was thinking, well, I just don't want it to be just this. Maybe it's grass. I don't want it just to be grass. I want it to be maybe sand dunes. Maybe it's erosion, and so this is all the minerals from all this place eroding away in brain corals underwater, right? So maybe the water levels have dropped, and so maybe there's these pools of water that have emerged, or that have remained, I guess, not emerged, from all this water, and all this sand is just from eroding away rock and different minerals and things like that. Very small edits, these two, it's very small, but I'm just trying to, just get a sense of this is kind of what it's gonna be. This is the overall idea. It's all here, right? I just gotta continue. It's still in value, so that's okay. On to the next step. Again, so I've copy paste the flattened image, and then I just work on top of it. So right now that I'm basically baking on the line art, essentially. so that I don't have to worry about jumping in between layers or things like that. So, let's see. I am defining some shapes right now. I'm defining some of the sand dunes going into the water. I'm really liking how that feels. I feel like I lost that, but that's okay. I'm kind of refining the shapes of a lot of these spires, to get them. This is what it's gonna look like. This is what this is gonna look like. This is what that's gonna look like. Just make things look a little more intentional. As I flip back and forth, you can see I'm defining that this hill is going this way. I'm defining the values of, this is going to be this value. There's going to be this value behind this shape, things like that. And here, so I thought it was too open. I feel like there was a lot of these spires that were the same size, and that's fine. But I felt like, you have maybe there's these giant spires in the background. And there's this one picture that I was inspired by. It's like this cave with a bunch of workers exploring it, and it's these giant crystal caves, and the crystals are kind of crisscrossing and going, all over the place, and you see these workers, and they're kind of dwarfed by these giant structures, and I thought that'd be kind of fun to combine with this coral structure. So I thought of putting a giant one right here, maybe blocking some light or something like that. But really, the main reason I put it there was to make the light part of this spire pop more than it would on a regular background, on the regular previous background. So if I put a white against that, that's gonna pop more than if it was against, this bright value. The contrast is higher, essentially, and so it allows the silhouette to read a little more, which is what you want, or what I wanted in this instance. Everything depends. So I just added some of that texture and basic atmosphere. Essentially, what I did was I took this round brush, I increased it inside, took the hardness way down, took a lasso tool, and carved out some shapes, and then took the light value of the atmosphere. So you don't want to go lighter than your sky value, and you just do a simple, and boom, you're done. And that looks, that already feels like, oh, that's going past, or that's creating a sand dune ridge. There's something behind there. That already kind of feels fun and cool. But it's too late now. I'm kidding. But yeah, already, it's super easy, super fast to define. This is in front of this. This is in front of that. So, if these are too close together, I can block this guy off, and then, do some more. So now it feels like, okay, now there's really a lot of layering going on, and you can feel that this is in front of that, and that's in front of this, and that's kind of the feeling that I wanted to achieve. But yeah, so basically did that. I have a very soft brush, did some rim lighting, basically deciding, okay, the light's gonna be coming from this way, so that's the way I'm doing it. And you can see that I've also put a subtle gradient of going from a mid-tone to a slightly darker, and I feel like that's kind of a cool gradient, because it's gonna, and then you're gonna have like this light value, and it's just gonna be a nice kind of reflected light effect, a gradient that's just gonna show through in the values even towards the end. So right now I'm just adding the light source, adding God rays, because those are always amazing, right? And I added a simple curves adjustment just to bring up the light value. So going on to the next one, let's see. So yeah, so it was at this point where I tried actually putting in photos of the brain coral texture, and it felt very artificial. I wasn't able to get the feeling right, so I just kind of said, whatever, I'll just paint it in myself and I'll design it as I go, kind of designing the look of this. So it's inspired by brain coral, but it's something slightly different. It's my interpretation of it, and I think that comes off a little more original, I guess. It's the same sort of idea. It's pretty much, and it's identifiable as brain coral, and that's kind of what you want. You want things to read as if you want people to relate to your original ideas, essentially. And so, people can identify this pretty easily that this is brain coral. As long as they know what brain coral looks like, they can make the connection a little easier. So right now I'm just putting in photos, just putting in a sand texture that I think I stretched and I warped, because that's hard for me to make up on my own. So I kind of just threw in a texture and then I painted on top of it. As you can see, if I zoom in, that's me painting on top of it with that texture brush. And then here's another sand dune texture that I found off the internet, and I just pasted in there. And I believe this is just defining the light on this rock here, and then drawing in or painting in more of the design into more of these spires. I forget what this, I can't seem to find what this is. These are just guidelines to where the sand is going. And then I just took the time, and this is a big step, but essentially I'm just going through and I'm just defining again, like this value right here, this is the darkest this plane is up yet. So I'm limiting myself here, but this is light. The darkest here is lighter than the darkest here. You can see that's a pretty big change, and that feels like it's going back in perspective. And again, that same dark is darker than the darkest value a little further, and look at that big change in value, right? And so it's these limiting of values that helps determine atmospheric perspective, essentially. And this is at the point where I was like, all right, I'm kind of feeling good about where everything's laying out, where the values are. So it's time to throw in some colors. So it was at this point where I started exploring with some gradient maps. I also explored putting on just looking for some photos and just kind of throwing on a color layer and just kind of looking for organic colors. But I think for the best way for me is through a gradient map and or through curves adjustments, or both. In this instance, I did a gradient map. I kind of got the blue atmosphere and the kind of a warm yellowy brown landscape, and then I threw curves on it because I feel like we've seen this before. This is a nice gradient map. It's a nice palette. It's kind of realistic. It could use a warmer light, but essentially I feel like we've seen it before. I feel like we've seen this a million times. And so I wanted to go a little more alien with it, a little more purpley, a little more warm with the landscape. Because why not? You might as well try. You can always change it later, but I really liked this color scheme, and so I kind of went with it. So let me just demonstrate. You can't really see what I'm doing here unless I did this. There we go. But essentially, you just go in and adjust the darks and the lights to the way you want. Maybe you want more blue, and maybe you want more red in the shadows, and then maybe you don't want any green, or maybe you want more green. Maybe you want more green in the shadows than in the light. Maybe that's a look that you're going for. Maybe you want no blue, maybe you want more blue. And that's kind of cool. That's kind of a cool palette, to start from, at least. And so that's kind of what I did, essentially. And then the next steps, so I'm going to teach you guys about, if you guys don't already know, there's 2 magical blending modes in Photoshop. Essentially, it's linear dodge and it's color dodge. Now, I don't know the exact math going on behind the scenes between these two blending modes. But what I do know is that it affects the way color interacts with your darks and your lights, essentially. And so for linear dodge, let's say we want this atmosphere to feel green or something like that. If you use a light green, the value, oh, actually, let me use a softer brush. The value of the color will affect your values, essentially. So it'll affect your darks and your lights. It'll affect everything, but it'll still maintain a lot of the darks, and the color will affect a lot of the darks. And so good rule of thumb is to use a dark saturated color so you can still maintain a lot of your values while also having this nice color interaction. So linear dodge is good, I found, for atmosphere because it adds color while also increasing the value as you go back in space. And so it affects the dark, and that's what essentially atmospheric perspective is that it's affecting the dark values of your elements. So, it adds this blue to all of the dark values, right? And that's pretty much what atmospheric perspective is. It's affecting, atmospheric perspective is affecting all of the colors. It's just basically putting a blue filter more and more as you're going backwards in space. But linear dodge is very good for it. Color dodge, on the other hand, as you can see, is that it affects the dark values in a different way, right? If I jump into my values, in my value proof, it's still affecting your values in color dodge, but not as extreme as linear dodge. And linear dodge is a little less intense than color dodge. So it really just depends on the look that you're going for. I find that for atmosphere, linear dodge is pretty good, but depending on your situation and the look that you want, color dodge may work for you. So in this case, I just use a soft brush and I put I wanted this nice cyan sort of blue kind of creeping in from the background. And then I wanted this nice purple. I really like the color interaction and how it kind of gets this purpley color, and then it goes to this orange, red, deep red. And then here I just used a polygonal lasso tool right here. And I basically, traced out these elements of where I want the sun rays to be. And then I went to color dodge, went to a dark saturated orange for sunlight, and then I just basically subtly, did a few strokes. And it's like, voila, you got your sunlight. You want to be very subtle about it. You don't want to be too intense because it can really affect not only your values, but just like the overall feeling. It's kind of like having too much bloom in a video game. It's kind of the same idea, I think. It's just you want to be tasteful about it. Essentially, that's just how I see it. It's really easy to go overboard with it. So just watch out. So at this point, I just established my light direction. I've established my color palette that I've liked. So now I'm continuing on. Oops. And now I'm basically going in. So at this session, I was like, all right, so here I am. I have basically my colors, my layout of where all the elements are. Now I just need to keep refining it. So essentially, this still looks very unfinished. A lot of this background looks unfinished. This foreground area is very undefined. So I'm just going in and defining all these things that still need to be visualized. So, I'm putting in the design for this, I'm adding some blue. So what I'm doing here, so let me just elaborate on what I'm doing here. What I'm doing with that cool brush is I'm going in, and in the shadow, you're gonna get a lot of ambient color coming in all sorts of different directions. And I'm not the greatest at explaining ambient lighting, but essentially you get light sources from all sorts of different places. So you're getting a light source from your main direct light, right? You're getting light from this sunlight, but then you're also getting light from the sky as well, from this blue color, from the atmosphere, and then you're also getting light from the main light hitting, a different part of the environment and bouncing into the downward facing planes of your object in the scene, essentially. So a lot of these are going to be hit with the atmosphere because we're in the shadow of a lot of these things, and so we're going to get a lot of ambient light on a majority of all of these objects. The rim light, the main directing sunlight, is only occupying a very finite amount of space. And so it's important to at least indicate that, yes, these structures are in this space and they exist within this environment. And a way to do that is to influence the sky color onto the upward facing planes in the shadows, essentially. And so what I was doing here was picking the color that I have for this, for these materials. And one cool thing so I have this plugin, and you can do this with the regular color picker, but because you guys can't see that, I'm just going to use this plugin. And I tend to use the lab color mode, and what lab stands for is lightness and then A and B. And A and B stands for how much green and red for A and how much blue and yellow for B. How much blue or yellow and red and green are in the specific color that you've picked. And then how bright or what the value is of that specific color. That's basically what these three values are. And the beauty of it is that you can pick a color and then you can adjust the hue without affecting the value. And that's extremely powerful because now you can get all sorts of color interactions without affecting the value, right? All these values are pretty, you can see the color differences, but it's the same value. And that's what's so powerful. You can slightly see it's a slight difference, but it's close enough that it's perceived the same, especially at a distance. And so the beauty of this is that I can go in and I can pick these colors, and then I can shift it towards blue, and then I can paint in something that feels a little more that's appropriate for this value, right? But it feels like it's being incorporated into this environment. So that's what I did here, essentially. I added, so it looks like I pretty much went like this into this purpley range, and I probably increased the value slightly because it is a light source that's coming in, and already that feels like, it's starting to be incorporated into this environment. It's the same sort of purpley from here. It kind of, it's starting to incorporate itself into the rest of the environment. And so I added this purpley, bluey sort of feel on the top upward facing planes, and then I added a saturated version of itself on the bottom facing planes. And that kind of makes it feel a little more grounded, especially through here or especially back here. and it kind of gives a more painterly feel. It kind of gives more color interaction. It makes things feel a little more interesting. You know, like right here, as this form curves around, there's a thing called the Fresnel effect, and as forms curve around, as they become tangent to your line of vision, just to draw it out really quick, this would take forever to explain. But very simply, you have this round object top down, and this is you. It as you start, you know, this is your line of vision, and as this is a perpendicular plane on this thing, and that's the most pure form of the color of the form that you're gonna see, untainted by a lot of reflections, unless it's like a really reflective material like a mirror. But as you continue to, so like right here, this plane is perfectly parallel to your line of vision, right? And as you approach that, the more reflective the sides are going to be. It's reflecting more of the environment, and you can see this on cars. Essentially, the next time you're sitting in traffic, the car in front of you is, you know, you're gonna have. I'm not very good at drawing cars, but essentially, you know, you're gonna have. Oh my gosh. Bear with me. This is the back of a car. So the color is going to be more intense here, and you're going to have more reflections on the sides of the car, essentially, if that makes sense. If this drawing, that's an awful drawing of a car, but you're going to get more, and that goes on all objects, even if it's the most velvet or matte of objects, you're going to get this Fresnel effect, and it just helps sit the thing in the environment, and you know, bring up your, you know, favorite 3D modeling rendering program, and it's gonna have, you can see it'll simulate that same exact effect, and if you don't simulate that, it feels very 3D and it feels very unnatural. So having the Fresnel effect as things curve around, so like up here, you know, I'm putting this atmosphere color, so not only am I using this blue for just cool light coming in, but you can also use the atmosphere color because that's what the surface is reflecting as it's curving around. So the more you put that on the sides, the more it's going to feel integrated into the environment. So that's just important to think about. I don't know the exact science, but James Gurney, imaginative color and light book, that explains it. Or Scott Robertson's How to Render, I believe, also explains that pretty in detail. Here I'm also throwing in a sand dune, throwing in some light, adding some glow to the pool, adding some water texture. Let's see. I'm kind of refining the sand dune effect. And then adding some sand textures right here. And it was at this point where, okay, so before I get into that, it was at this point where I think the favorite part of this illustration started to emerge, I believe. Pretty sure. Yeah. And so, let me just fast forward a little bit. I'll explain all of this. Yeah, okay. So, a special thing happened. Actually, let me just go through. So I'm defining, kind of solidifying these shapes a little more. And then I went into the skull. So we'll get into this guy. Basically, I took a photo of a skull off the internet, and I pasted him in here. And he came in super bright and totally not within the same value range as this that I've established. And so you have to go into your levels and adjust the darks and the lights to match where you're putting them, and then it'll start to feel a little more integrated, and then you kind of adjust the you add the color of your darks to it, and it'll start to feel a little more integrated. Right now I'm just adding I'm adding that blue color just to make it feel like it's being affected by this atmosphere. Adding a little more design elements. I feel like there's an opportunity for a pun here, or not really a pun, but just like a funny idea, is that, since it's brain coral, wouldn't it be funny if it was coming out of a skull? Ha ha ha. Anyway, so I thought it was kind of fun. But, it also kind of looks like smoke kind of billowing out and then solidifying. So it's like this cool, I don't know, something. But I wanted the structure to be kind of emerging from it. That's kind of the idea. And I put more very subtly into the background. I wanted this one to read first. The other ones can be subtle. I wasn't really too worried about them. Continuing on, refining these shapes, making sure they're separated from each value element. Like you could see here that this feels a little too samey, and so I think eventually I get around to fixing that. But here I am adding some more of the sand dune texture. Just photos that I'm literally just warping, and then I'm adjusting the values. So again, you want to switch into so let me explain what I'm doing here. So Control Y shows a proof basically, and sometimes it's default to CMYK for printing, so you can see what your colors are going to look like when you print them out. But for me, since I work mainly digitally and most of my work is seen digitally, I've changed that to a black and white version. And it's a black and white version that maintains the values. Sometimes when you do black and white, if you desaturate it or you go through these different filters, it can kind of mess with the values and the colors. With this, I found that it maintains the values of the colors pretty efficiently. There's a little difference, but it's not too bad. And the way you do it is you go to View, you can't see it here, but you go to View, and then there's Proof Setup, and then you go to Custom. And I'll walk you guys through this, but essentially there's a little window that comes up, and it says Proof Conditions, Device to Simulate, and you look through this giant list of different, devices or things to simulate, different outcomes or different requirements. And there's a working gray dot gain 20%. And then you hit OK, and every time you hit Control Y, you get your values. And so it's a very quick way to kind of bounce back and forth without having to go into adjustments and mess around with that. You could just hit Control Y, zoom out, make sure everything's reading, zoom back in, and get on with your life. It's super fast, super easy, super efficient. It's what we like to see. So here, okay, so I'm refining. Again, I'm still refining. I'm just going through the motions of just what do I want these things to look like. And I found, so every time I do a painting, there's always one random tiny aspect of this painting that is just like, that is my favorite part of the painting. And oftentimes, it's not even the focal point. And in this case, it's this area right here. It's so dumb and random, but it feels like the sand dune is going into this water, and it feels like the water is glowing, and I just managed to get the dark to light gradient just subtle enough to make it feel right, and I think that's my favorite part of this whole painting. But anyway, so going through the motions, adding some darker values to water. So water, as it goes away from you, it gets more reflective. So you want to put more of so it's darker towards you, and most times a lot lighter, and it's because it's that Fresnel effect. So basically, if I were to draw it out on a plan view, so this was you, and then this is water essentially. So you're able to see through the water pretty well as it goes inwards here. But as your viewing angle becomes more parallel to the surface of the water, the more reflective it gets, essentially. So again, the further out it goes, the more reflective of the sky it is. So yeah, water is a tough thing to paint, but this definitely gives you a little kind of, a way to depict water a little more realistically if you're having a lot of trouble with it. So it's usually darker towards you, towards the center, and then towards the edges and away from you. It becomes more of a sky and the environment. And also depending on how rough the water is can determine the overall value and how much you're going to see the environment. And then I also added a glow to these pools of water because maybe it's a magical water or something like that. Glowy things are fun, so why not? And I'm basically refining these edges, and I'm also adding some more lighting to defining this form. This blue helps separate these two values from the foreground to this thing that goes back into space. And then for this final group, let's see, where did we go? Oh, I'm basically going in and I'm defining the shapes of these background elements just subtly. I'm using that textured brush, and these values are so close together that it's subtle enough to feel, that it's back in space. So you don't really need to define too much because the audience gets it. Like, this is that, just further away. And then this is that, just giant and further away. You don't need to go in and define every nitty-gritty detail. Just saves you time, essentially. I'm adding some color because I felt like the color fall off was too intense. Like, it's purple and then it's this other color, as if there's like a void, a giant gap between here and there. And so I added just a soft light layer with this purpley sort of thing, and I just kind of went with a soft brush and I kind of just brought it closer. You can tell the slight difference. Continuing to refine the shapes in the background, going through, and so I thought that this area of the light was too sharp, so I went in and I blended it, added some more color dodge of this sunlight because I thought it was getting too lost. I felt like, the warmth was getting too lost, so I added it where it needed to be added. Added some color dodge of this atmosphere because it feels a little more magical, a little more mysterious, a little more alien. And here I am refining more of the shape. You want to make your shapes feel intentional. A lot of my paintings, my edges tend to get a little soft and a little ambiguous. So it's always good to just take the time and just define your edges and make it feel intentional of the things that are in focus. Things that are out of focus, you can kind of play with the edges a little more. But overall, I'm just trying to make things intentional. Here, I'm starting to add, so I found like this bone texture off of the internet, and I put it on a linear burn layer. Try out different layers, what works for, or blending mode, see what works for you. I put it on a lower opacity and erase a lot of it to make it feel a little more natural. There we go. Just to kind of define what these things could be made out of. Because it's so close, we get a chance to see the tertiary read of these things, and because they're so far away, maybe we're not really sure what the next level of detail is. Well, it's right here. This is what it kind of looks like. And I kind of added some of that variance of value. And then I also added some rock photos just to make things feel a little natural going in. So I played around with whether or not I wanted the skull to glow, the inside of the skull to glow. And it felt really artificial for the longest time. But then I ended up putting this little, if I can find it, this little image of a campfire. It's really tiny. I just shrunk it down and placed it in there. And then I kind of gave this nice orange glow, and it kind of feels like somebody's living there. Then I also added some torches. You know, it feels like there's an inhabitant or there's inhabitants existing in this space. Kind of feels a little more lived in, and that's cool. A little history. Brought up the value of this with a photo. Just found a sand texture online and I warped it, and then I put it on a soft light and I lowered it down to 48%. Erased a lot of it. The main idea is that you just want this variance of, you just want these imperfections and these different variances in value that you just can't get, or at least that I just can't get. I can't get normally with just regular painting. And so a photo, just slap it in there, blend it in, adjust the values. It'll look good. And don't be afraid to do it. Let's see, what am I adding here? Nothing. Absolutely. Going through. This is the issue with having a lot of layers that aren't named or aren't relevant, is that you can't always see what's going on. Oh yeah, so here I basically added some very subtle highlights just to make it feel a little less, or a little more integrated into the structure. And then again, I'm brightening up this edge just to differentiate it from this value right here. And then redefining these shapes, making everything feel a little less soft or a little more intentional. Things are okay if they look soft, but you just want to make it look intentional. You know, like this is in the foreground and it's not necessarily in focus. So I don't need to be so crisp about everything. Whereas this, you know, it better be crisp, right? And now we're almost done. Oh yeah, so at this point, I like to send this off to a lot of my friends and be like, hey, how's this looking? You know, and they're like, all right, well, you know, you could change this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and the other thing, and they can, you know, it gives you a fresh eye. And this is at the point where it's like, all right, I've looked at this piece way too much. Time for somebody else to look at it. And one of the big critiques was that this spire in the background was literally right in the exact center, and it kind of bisects the entire frame. So that's not always a good thing. Sometimes it is, depending on what you want. But in this case, thought it was stronger just to move it over, and it kind of frames this a little nicer, instead of being everything so evenly spaced. Boom, 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 boom. You know, kind of bring this closer, kind of group this area together, kind of give this a little more space to breathe. And then I blended the edges of that because I just cut it. And then at the end, I really like to mess around with the curves, and just see, do I really like these colors, or do other colors work more? Like if I, what happens if I really increase the green and I, decrease the blue? Like, do I like this more? This feels more like sand. It feels kind of relatable. This feels a little more blue. You kind of get some different colors in there, and it's like, well, do I like this? Maybe I want it moodier, and so I really bring all the blues and the greens down. Maybe that looks cool to me. Maybe this looks cool to me. Maybe making it darker, is cool. Because we have the values set up, because we were so careful about it, we can take this extra step and really kind of have fun with the colors towards the end, because the values still work, right? And no matter how light or dark we get, because we've structured them in a way that reads even at such a small scale, we can make these big adjustments, right? And this feels a little more at nighttime. We get a little nicer glow out of the skull, but it felt a little too dreary and a little too intimidating, so I kind of kept it a little more whimsical. You could totally go in this direction. That's totally fine. Nothing wrong with it. But I just chose not to. And then for the last few steps, I always like to I have a hotkey that basically puts everything. So in a lot of my process, a lot of things can look soft. You know, a lot of things can get lost. And so if you go to filter, if you control A, select everything, and then copy, merge, and paste it all into one layer, and then you go to filter, sharpen, and then unsharp mask. What it does is it basically brings out all of the detail that you put in, and it kind of makes things feel a little sharper. You know, it makes your brush strokes feel a little sharper, makes things feel a little more intentional and a little less soft. And what's cool is that, you know, you can also do a depth of field thing where, you know, if you duplicated this and then you go to filter and you blur it with a Gaussian blur, you know, you blur it out crazy, and then you go in and you erase the sharp one where you don't want it to be in focus, you know, you can get this fun depth of field effect. That's fun if you're going for that sort of thing, right? You know, you can have like this cool focus. You know, you can blur it even more. Oops. Did it backwards. But yeah, you can blur it even more, and you can get an even more intense effect. You know, if you're going for that sort of thing. I wasn't really going for that, but that can look cool in certain situations. But so for unsharp mask, that's that step. And then the last thing I do is I always make a new layer, get the black color and just fill with darkness, and then you go to filter, pixelate or noise, and then you add noise. You use Gaussian, monochromatic. You add as much or as little as you like, and then change that to overlay or soft light. And now you want to be subtle with this. This is like a film grain. You know, if this was shot on 35 millimeter film, you know, got to take into account, you know, ISO and things like that. And you know, you can adjust the values, or you can adjust the percentage to make it more subtle. Because if you leave it at 100%, again, it's going to affect the values tremendously, and it's going to look kind of gross. So you really want to be subtle with this last change, because it can really give a sense of life and kind of put everything under the same lens, if that makes sense. It kind of, you know, it very subtly makes things feel a little more, okay, this is under some sort of lens, kind of. And it's the same thing with putting like a glaze over an oil painting. It makes everything kind of feel cohesive. So you want to be subtle with that. I think I only used 14%. And there we go. And that's basically it. Is it perfect? No. But it's done. In my eyes, it is for now. Could I have spent, you know, 20 more hours? Sure. But I think I only spent about 9 hours on this painting. I streamed 3 sessions and about 3 hours each. So that was 9 hours. 9 or 10 hours with a few breaks in between. It was a really fun piece. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Yeah, there might be more of this in the future if you guys are interested. And I hope this was entertaining, or at least somewhat informative, or just, you know, something. Anyway, thanks for watching, and see you guys next time.